It's lovely to see so many of you joining us here today. I think we'll kick off. This session has been brought to you by the Glasgow Fair Food for All partnership, and that's in collaboration with the Scottish Refugee Council and being supported by the Glasgow Centre for Population Health. My name is Faiza Hansraj Jackson. I'm a public health practitioner specialist at the Glasgow Centre for Population Health, and I'm also the coordinator for Glasgow's Cash First project. Today's session will tell you more about asylum seekers and refugees, why they're likely to experience food insecurity, and what sources of support are available. The presentation will then be followed by the opportunity for you to ask questions. Before we start, I just want to let you know that today's webinar is being recorded, and we will circulate the link for this to everyone that's on this call. You will also be able to access the link on the GCPH website, along with other GCPH webinars. As Bérangère, my colleague, has just written in the chat, if you do have any questions for our speakers today, please use the Q&A function only. We'll do our best to get your questions answered, but we might not be able to ask all of them due to the high number of attendees here today. We would ask you to use the Q&A function only for questions rather than for general comments. Our events team will be using the chat function to post links relevant to the presentations. I'm now very pleased to introduce you to Shohana Shabnam. Shohana Shabnam is the Learning and Development Officer at the Scottish Refugee Council. She is part of the Learning and Development team, which leads training and information resource development for refugees, practitioners, and organisations. Shohana's key role is to facilitate learning and knowledge sharing about the ever-changing asylum system, and to promote best practice for practitioners working with people seeking asylum and refugees. Shohana is going to start by giving us an introduction to the Scottish Refugee Council and telling us a bit about UK asylum law and protection routes to the UK. She will then move on to the rights and support for people seeking asylum and how this can lead to food insecurity. She will also share sources of support that are available. Just a note, Shohana is very kindly filling in for her colleague Susie, who has unfortunately lost her voice. However, Susie is online and available to answer questions along with Shohana. Without any further ado, I'll now hand you over to Shohana.
Thanks very much, Faiza, for that quick introduction. And thank you for inviting me today. So I'm with Susie, as Faiza mentioned. I'll go straight into the presentation, and Faiza has given us a very good introduction. So what we will cover today, first we will look at Scottish Refugee Council, what we do and who we work with. And then we will briefly touch upon the asylum law and other protection routes in the UK. And we will look at some of the rights and entitlements people have while they're in the asylum process. We will also look at how this can lead into food insecurity, because the system itself has some systemic structural issues that impacts on people. We will also look at some sources of support and resources. And at the end of the session, my understanding is we will share a handout with you. This webinar is also recorded, and all the resource links will go to you as well. So don't worry about trying to take screenshots or take notes. You will get everything at the end of the session. So what do we do about Scottish Refugee Council? We are an independent charity. We're dedicated to support people in need of refugee protection. We have around 100 staff, 91 volunteers, and we do provide this support in many different ways. Our refugee support service has different direct support advice service run by qualified advisors. So our first port of call is our helpline, and it provides information and signposting support to people in need of refugee protection, which includes asylum seekers and refugees. We also give advice, information to organizations, practitioners, and other public who needs information. We also have a family rights service that works with asylum-seeking families and provides support and works with legal advisors, so alongside lawyers to support people go through the asylum system. We have a refugee integration project. So the integration project works with people once they are newly granted as refugees and support them through the transition. And we also have a destitution support project, which works with people who are at the end of asylum system, have become appeal rights exhausted, and are trying to find their feet. We provide practical support as well as working with legal advisors, lawyers, to make sure people can put in further submissions and progress future asylum claims. We have a community development team that works with community groups across Scotland, and we also have a policy advocacy team and then training and resource development where Susie and I work together. Okay, so asylum law in the UK. First, let's look at the definition of an asylum seeker. An asylum seeker is a person who has fled their country and is seeking protection from persecution in another country. Basically, they're waiting for a decision on their claim. Everyone has a right to claim asylum. It is a human right, and it is governed by the 1951 UN Refugee Convention. In the UK, we also have domestic legislation that sets out how asylum claims will be processed in the UK. And asylum laws are part of immigration matters, so it's a reserved matter for the UK government to pass law on. For example, Scottish Parliament cannot pass laws on asylum and immigration. I think that's very important to set that scene and that context that it is an immigration is a reserved matter. However, we do have people seeking asylum in Scotland, so that actually has an impact on how they experience Scotland and what rights and entitlements they can access in Scotland. Within the asylum law in UK, a key point we want to flag up is that people can't apply or claim asylum from outside the UK. So people must enter the UK to claim asylum. There is no asylum seeker's visa or application process from outside the UK. This means that we know that people who need to seek asylum have to enter the UK most of the times without permission. And that is the basis of the law. And that is acceptable and understood in legislation. Although recently there has been attempts to criminalize entry into the UK, however, our legislation still understands and supports that people have to come into the UK without permission to seek asylum. When people arrive in the UK, some people can apply for asylum at port, and some can. So a port will be like a land port, a airport, or a seaport. And others, if they're already in the UK, they can claim asylum by calling the Home Office's Asylum Intake Unit, and there is an appointment line for it. So both ways, people can claim asylum in the UK. So we will then look into asylum applications in the UK and where do people flee from. I just want to mention that these figures are mostly focusing on people claiming asylum. So we haven't included other figures like people arriving through visa schemes or other nationality-based schemes or resettlement schemes that UK government have put together. So in terms of asylum applications in the UK, in year ending June 2024, we had 75,658 asylum applications, and this relates to 97,107 people. And this includes often main applicants, and especially when they're applying with a family, for example, children or spouse or partner. So that's just over 97,000 people and 75,658 applications. Top source countries for asylum applications to the UK, year ending June 2024, you can see some of the names. The top 5 I'll mention is Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, Vietnam, Bangladesh. What we notice when we every year when we look at these figures is these countries change. So sometimes countries may drop off towards the bottom of that list, and sometimes they come up on the list, and it often depends on what kind of conflict is happening at the time and what other drivers are there in terms of people fleeing persecution in those countries. This is not to say that these are the only countries. These are the top 10 source countries where we are receiving asylum applications from. Next information we put together is, because we are sharing more UK-wide information, is just to see in relation to Scotland how the figures look like. So Glasgow is at the top host local authorities for asylum seekers. And Glasgow has now 3,868 asylum seekers present. In Aberdeen City, that's 400, Aberdeenshire, 193. So progressively it's less and less, but we now have Perth and Kinross, Inverclyde and Edinburgh as well, where we have people housed in asylum accommodation and waiting for their claim to be processed. You may wonder about some of these countries and why people are coming from these countries, because sometimes the reasons are not obvious. So at the end of the training session webinar, we will share handouts, and there are country information you can look up. So we will link to those so you know that why people are fleeing from those countries. Okay, we will move on to the next slide and look at some of the other protection routes. The asylum route we have covered. So mainly we say there are three main protection routes for people seeking sanctuary in the UK. The first one is the asylum route. The next two is the resettlement route, which is more the refugee resettlement route. And increasingly in last few years, although not new, we are seeing more nationality-based schemes, for example, the Afghan schemes and the Ukraine schemes. Resettlement route involves selection and transfer of refugees from a country in which they have sought protection. Usually it's camps, refugee camps, and often the resettlement happened to a third country which has agreed to admit them. And this third country, for example, could be UK. And the resettlement criteria, there will be some strict criteria set for who can be assessed and selected for relocation and resettlement in the UK. So these are not all refugees who can arrive to the UK or other third countries. Each country has their own system, own criteria, and UN Refugee Agency usually manage this process. In the UK, they work with the Home Office and local authorities. People go through that assessment process. They identify people for resettlement and support them to come to the UK with support from local authorities. It's important to note that people cannot apply for any resettlement route, so they need to be selected. But once they'll arrive, they actually arrive with refugee status or humanitarian protection, but most of the times refugee status. Other than that, we talked briefly about the nationality-based schemes. These are schemes created by the UK government in reaction to situations, and often in reaction to a particular conflict. And often it's targeting a particular nationality that we have seen in the case of Ukraine and Afghanistan. In the past, we have seen it with Syrians, and many, many years ago, we have seen it with Vietnamese nationalities as well. So the criteria of these schemes differ vastly. For example, Ukraine schemes are actual visa routes with very limited criteria to meet, and that application process is fairly straightforward and quick, and people can then come to the UK with 3 years leave to remain, which has now changed to 18 months if they're arriving now. Afghan schemes are not visa schemes at all. So these are schemes that has set assessment criteria. It's a very managed process, similar to resettlement route, and it has a lot more stricter assessment criteria, and it takes longer for people to arrive as well. Just for context, for example, year ending June 2024, under Ukraine schemes, there are 28,419 visa granted. And in the same period, 7,711 people arrived through the Afghan schemes. Okay, so that's quickly a snapshot of the key protection routes to the UK. We will now look into rights and entitlements of people seeking asylum. So first off, you may be familiar with the word no recourse to public funds, or NRPF, and that's basically applies to many migrants, and asylum seekers are also have no access to public funds, which basically means asylum seekers have no access to apply for universal credit or pension credit, and they cannot access homelessness support. There are other types of support they can get, but those are the 2-3 main benefits and homelessness support that they cannot get. If they are destitute, they can request Home Office to provide them financial or accommodation support, and that is managed by the Home Office through a different system. It's not part of UK's social welfare system. Asylum seekers also have other restrictions. For example, they have limited right to work, and most of them cannot work for the first 12 months after applying for asylum. And after 12 months, if they can show that the delay was through no fault of their own, they can ask for permission from the Home Office. So if the Home Office issued permission, asylum seekers then can work, but they can only work to some limited jobs. So these are called jobs. These are listed under the immigration salary list. Previously, it used to be called shortage occupation list. So the immigration salary list has some limited number of jobs they can do. And in terms of kind of low entry level, low entry requirement jobs, there are some healthcare jobs, care work, and some construction jobs. But it is quite a difficult list and quite restricted as well. So in terms of education, children, young people can access nursery, primary, secondary education like any other Scottish resident. And restrictions increases as people move through to further education and higher education. So part-time further education, there is funding. I need to actually clarify one thing, that asylum seekers do have right to study. The issue is right to access funds. So in terms of part-time further education up to HNC level, there is funding for asylum seekers to study, but they cannot do full-time. And in terms of higher education, young asylum seekers and refugees are entitled to SAS fee funding, but so that's like home fee, and that they can get that funding. However, they're not eligible for living cost support. So until people get refugee status. And that's important to flag because that means that adult asylum seekers have this kind of restriction on accessing higher education. And there are options like looking at sanctuary scholarships or other types of bursaries and scholarships and grants, but it is quite harder for people to progress into further education and higher education. I need to also mention that most ESOL classes are free. However, due to funding cuts, we know that more colleges are now starting to charge for some ESOL classes, but generally speaking, full-time and part-time ESOL classes people can access for free. However, there is a really long waiting list. It's a very long waiting list for people. And that really is restrictive because if they have language barriers, they need to learn English, they have to wait for a really long time. The last 2 points are on legal aid and National Health Service. So both asylum seekers can access legal aid. It depends on, of course, people's income. And if they are eligible, the same rules apply and they can access it. Okay, so that's a quick snapshot of rights of people seeking asylum. We will look into what kind of financial support, accommodation support Home Office provides to asylum seekers. So the first off, financial support and accommodation is on the basis of people are destitute, so they cannot support themselves. So they need subsistence support and they cannot live anywhere else because they're destitute or about to become destitute. So when people make applications to the Home Office make a decision on their application, and if they are dispersed to an accommodation, asylum accommodation, that is no choice. So there is a no choice dispersal policy, it's called. And you may have all been familiar with Glasgow being a dispersal city for decades, and partly why we have the largest number of asylum seekers in Scotland living in Glasgow. So if people are dispersed in asylum accommodation, and there are different types of accommodation, like contingency, initial accommodation. These will mostly look like hotels or self-catered asylum accommodation that's based in communities. You may have picked up on people living in barges, housed in disused army military barracks as well, but hotels will be the most commonly used at the moment. And when people are living in self-catered accommodation, the financial support people get is per week £49.18 per person. If they're living in a hotel, the food is provided, and that's £8.86 per person. And we will come a little bit more around food and kind of discuss how this can have different impact on different groups of people. So when people are living in hotels, there are meals provided in those hotels, so people have no choice over cooking. There are no cooking facility, and they have to eat that hotel food every day, and it can be quite repetitive. And for children, there is serious concerns about lack of child-friendly, healthy options. And there are concerns also about not having enough food for children as well. On top of that, food is often unfamiliar. People are not used to it. And many people really struggle with food in hotels for a really long period of time. If people are in self-catering, there is also that whole issue about having limited budget and having to travel far or try to access foods people are familiar with or consider as good food. So this all creates a bit of difficult situation for people who are living in hotels or in self-catered accommodation. Slightly separate issues experienced, but there are some common issues as well. So we will now look at what happens. This is when people were in asylum process, and we will now look at what happens when people transition to be recognized as refugees. So that means their asylum claim is accepted. Home Office recognized them to have a refugee protection need, and they have received either a refugee status or a humanitarian protection status, which are the most common forms of leave to remain people in the asylum claim have, although there are other types of leave to remain as well. So once people are granted refugee status, this is a positive step. People can work, so there is no restrictions on any or most jobs. They can do any jobs, and people can access public funds, which is crucial. That means people can apply for benefits. They can easily apply for bank accounts. However, this could be quite a difficult time because there are certain pinch points where people could experience food insecurity. So this is a period where people could be vulnerable. A particular point that happens is the move-on period. So following the grant of status, people have 28 days or 4 weeks to set up their bank account, apply for universal credit or pension credit, whichever is relevant. If they're not working, apply for homelessness assistance from local authorities, so they need to enter the homelessness system. So this period is called the move-on period, and financial hardship and potential destitution is often built into this move-on period for people. It's simply because the processes don't always work well, but even when processes work, for context, universal credit application takes around 5 to 6 weeks to process, but the move-on period is 4 weeks. So again, destitution is built into it. People with refugee status can apply for Scottish Welfare Fund crisis grants. So, but again, that can take time, and people can fall through the net and can experience short-term periods of insecurity. Other times we notice that people can experience insecurities when they have a family reunion event coming up. So as part of their right to have refugee family reunion, they are having new family members joining them, and changes to benefits, housing needs, everything have an impact on how much money people have. And that's also another period where we see the pinch point of food insecurity can increase. Other periods, also we noticed during the move-on period or transitioning from move-on period into mainstream benefit and social security is often if people are working in low jobs, so they are adjusting to that work income having impact on benefits or reducing benefits, or also when people are adjusting to having an increased amount of money through benefits, but new responsibility to pay bills, for example, like utilities and council tax. There are other challenges within this period that happens. We know a lot of issues around delays and errors around biometric residence permit. UK government is changing and replacing physical biometric residence permit card, and we are moving into online proof of leave to remain, which is called e-visa. So the digital only identity documents are going to cause new problems for people, and the transition process, there's been a lot of concern about that as well. And other than that, the standard difficulty in navigating mainstream benefit system to a cohort of people who were never part of it is also a big challenge. Okay, so we looked at asylum support, asylum rights and entitlements, and also the rights people have when they're transitioning from asylum to having refugee status or leave to remain in the UK. Some of the key challenges or additional challenges people face that we just want to touch upon briefly, not want to go into too much detail, is issues around language barrier and isolation. So if people are in hotels or remote areas, less social networks having an impact on barriers to integration. There is also ongoing trauma people may have experienced before coming to the UK during their journey, and also after arriving in the UK when they're navigating the asylum system. The experience of displacement also is very disruptive to people's education, career, employment. So being job ready or job skills could be a huge challenge for people to navigate. And in addition to that, there is that whole challenge around understanding a new culture and making connections. And food is part of it as well in the UK, and especially when people have not a lot of money to make informed choices about food. And lastly, the key issue is navigating the asylum system in itself, and transitioning to refugee status in itself is a hugely difficult process, challenging process for people to go through, or could be. It's not necessarily for everyone a difficult process, but most people say that this is a really difficult process in their life. And that itself puts a lot of strain on people's mental health and well-being. And the final point we want to kind of connect to is that whole issue around digital connectivity. So not having access to digital devices, access digital connections, for example, internet, and not having the right tools and skill set as well. So there is a variety of challenge and barriers people face, because many services are designed around people having those knowledge and skills, and also access. Okay, so we will now look at how does all this linked to food insecurity. Susie will share a couple of links around some really good work and ongoing work going on. And two I really want to mention is the work Govan Community Project does, and some of the reports, projects, the research they have done, as well as the Nourish Scotland toolkits. Highly recommend if you are really wanting to do further reading. Both are really useful resources to have. So, ongoing food emergency mentioned in the Govan Community Project research report that Susie will share. This relates to people in the asylum process, because the nature of the asylum system itself means people seeking asylum are in an ongoing state of food emergency, right? So many food support provisions are set out to deal with short-term food insecurity. So the cash first, income maximization, all of that concept comes from that people have fallen into poverty temporarily and they will get out of it. With people in the asylum system, this is systemic. This is structural and it's long term. So that experience is being in that food emergency on an ongoing basis is a very difficult system. This is why sometimes cash, we say, and the research shows that cash first approach cannot be effective for asylum seekers because they just don't have access to the appropriate funds. So that means they are relying heavily on their social networks, charities, community groups for food, with very little choice sometimes deciding on what they can eat. And that's a really difficult situation in relation to food insecurity. There is also that reliance on home office, and that reliance on home office removes the freedom of choice as we looked at asylum accommodation, the no choice dispersal process, where people are housed, how far is good food or appropriate food for them, how far is the shops they like to shop in are, how much money they have to buy those food, and if they do, whether or not they have cooking facilities and ability to cook those food anyway. So within the refugee asylum population, there is this whole challenge as well that it's not a homogeneous group. It represents a really diverse range of cultures and food habits. So one size doesn't fit all, and it can be difficult, especially sometimes food providers. An example will be food banks have to rely on donations from supermarkets or individuals, and it's often unlikely to be food people are used to. So, for example, often there might not be halal options, there might not be fresh fruit and vegetables. And that difficulty, we know a lot of really good work food banks are looking at as well to see how alternative options can be introduced, more choice can be included, and not just food banks. We know across Glasgow there is some incredible work going on around the whole pantry model, community food models, where people are trying to explore and look at more choices for people. But ultimately, overall, this whole food insecurity creates that feeling a lack of dignity. And that is particularly acute when people are in the asylum process, especially when they're accessing food support from different organizations, their social networks, or their community food providers. And that's really plays into that whole experience of how people feel they have no choice or no voice within the asylum system. So that's overall some of the key issues around food insecurity experienced by asylum seekers and refugee population. And we know that Susie will also share the Nourish Scotland research report, which looked at kind of ways to design services involving people in decision making, recognizing the social value of food, and recognizing food has a really important role to play in people's sense of belonging and identity, and also kind of principles of providing opportunities to people to contribute. So not that one way receiving food without no choice. And then also, incorporating that sense of power, giving people power to choose as well, and looking at different models. So that's possibly brings me to local support in Glasgow. And there are so many because of historical reasons, because of Glasgow being that dispersal city, because of the strong communities that's been built in Glasgow. These are not the only organizations in Glasgow that work with asylum seekers, refugees, and it doesn't even have to be just refugee-specific organizations. We know there are lots of community groups, mosques, churches, community centers, football clubs, all sorts of opportunities and incredible initiatives going on all around Glasgow. If you would like to share some of them here with us, that's great. We just put this out just because these are some of the key ones we come across often. And this brings me more towards the end of our presentation. We have put together some training we deliver, and Susie is the main one who leads on it. And we deliver this training regularly, all this training regularly. If you're interested, you can go into our website and book or contact Susie if you want us to commission us a training. And so we can have further conversations about future training needs if you would like to. And final point is about our helpline. That's the number. You will get it in your handout anyway. Helpline is free and it provides confidential information advice. We do provide an interpreter if people need one. So that's quite a crucial service and almost a first point of contact for individuals in need of refugee protection. So helpline covers lots of issues. There is issues around money, housing, healthcare, education, learning English, accessing legal support. So it opens Monday 9 to 5 p.m. and actually Wednesday is short day, afternoon, and then Friday again 9 to 3 p.m. That brings me to the end of my presentation.
So finally, a very special thank you to the Glasgow Centre for Population Health Communications team for helping us to put this event on today. Thank you all ever so much, and I hope you have a great rest of day. Thank you. Bye now.